Hello, comrades. Thank you for joining us for another session of Why Marx. We're continuing to look at the question of party and program. And tonight we're looking at the Parti Ouvrier Française's program, which was, in part at least, written by Karl Marx himself. So it should teach us a few things about his attitude to the question of party and program. I'm very pleased to have with us Ian Spencer, who will lead the introduction, and we'll have lots of time for questions and comments afterwards. Over to you, Ian. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening, comrades, and welcome back. The the program of the Parti Ouvrier Français is one of those little gems, really, of Marxist literature. You can just read it as a kind of standalone thing, and it's very short. It's striking how short it is, but it's also interesting how long its gestation was. Marx was intimately involved in French politics for many years. Um, the French working class movement was hugely influential on Marx, as were the ideas of the French Revolution, and therefore it almost seems logical that Marx should have a hand in the writing of the program of the Parti Ouvrier Français. Having said that, the background and the lead up to it is also important because it is against the context of the whole history, for example, of the Communist Manifesto, subsequent developments with regard to the Paris Commune, and the development of a workers' movement. And what we see is a recurring theme in terms of how communists, defined in terms of adherence to kind of Marx's ideas, Marx's perspectives, have had to differentiate themselves from a whole range of different other working class movement perspectives. And it is partly that which I think lies at the heart of the importance of the program. And you can see you can follow the kind of gestation, if you like, of the program of the Parti Ouvrier Français from the Communist Manifesto through to that party, and then of course later on with things like the Erfurt program in the German Social Democratic Party and so on. So without further ado, just a little reminder of Marx's relationship to the French workers' movement and Marx's time spent in Paris between 1843 and 1845. The Rheinische Zeitung was suppressed, and leaving Marx to move to work on the German-French yearbook, the German-French annals, and and that's where he met Engels for the second time. The first time Marx and Engels met, it was a rather kind of chilly kind of meeting because Marx regarded Engels as sort of being still under the influence of the young Hegelians, who he was already outpacing in terms of his intellectual and political development, in particular Arnold Ruger. And it's said that when Marx and Engels met the second time in Paris, of course, he had a few more things to be going on. He'd read Engels' essay on political economy, and it's often overlooked that Engels was the first one to start the serious study of a critique of political economy, in particular, a critique of British political economy. It's typical to say English, but actually, of course, Adam Smith was a Scot. And it's that really that then formed such a huge part of Marx's subsequent intellectual and political development. And so that meeting in Paris was really a kind of a momentous period in the development of communist ideas. Marx also wrote the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, sometimes known as the Paris Manuscripts. And it's still an absolute joy to read them, not only because you can see the development of capital, some of the early ideas that would subsequently emerge in the critique of political economy, but also a contribution to the critique of political economy, but also then subsequently volume of capital. And beyond that, you see some of the most developed ideas around communism as being more than just about how the organization of the economy is. It's much more about the transition to being a truly human society, a truly human society in which humanity can become fully human for the first time, freed from the want of starvation, apart from anything else, and all other forms of scarcity. So the economic and philosophic manuscripts, and it's often overlooked that the economic and philosophic manuscripts were not widely read at all until the later part of the 20th century. Um, Also, whilst in Paris, Marx and Engels worked together on the book that became The Holy Family, which was published in 1845, which was his kind of decisive break with Ludwig Feuerbach and Bruno Bauer. And so this period was enormously fertile. It's the period really in which Marx is becoming a communist from having been a thoroughgoing radical Republican. Um, uh, he was eventually exiled from France at the request of the Prussian government and moved to Brussels. And of course, there was the meeting of the Communist Correspondence Committee, the coming together of the League of the Just, and eventually with Marx's move to London, eventually the Manifesto of the Communist Party, uh, written in 1847 through to 8 and published in 1848, just in time for the revolutions that were sweeping Europe at the time. And I couldn't resist putting out this magnificent book, The Adventures of the Communist Manifesto by Hal Draper, um, because it's, of course, an important observation that the Communist Manifesto is itself a minimum maximum program. The Communist Manifesto, the maximum program is the abolition of private property. And that, in a nutshell, is the central theme of the Communist Manifesto. But in the chapter uh, on so in Hal Draper's book, it's on page 161. There are a whole series of minimum demands. Marx, for example, goes on to say, um, for the most advanced countries, however, the following can be put into effect fairly generally. One, expropriation of landed property and use of ground rent to pay state expenses. So the nationalization of land, a heavy progressive tax, abolition of the right of inheritance, confiscation of the property of all emigres and rebels, centralization of credit in the hands of the state through a national bank with a state capital, with state capital and an exclusive monopoly, centralization of the whole transportation system in the hands of the state, increasing in national factories and instruments of production, reclamation and improvement of land in accordance with the common plan, equal obligation to work for everybody, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. So there are just some of the minimum demands, and they're still refreshingly radical now. Um, of course, the emphasis upon the state is very much of its time. And of course, in the context of a fragmented Germany, the idea of a state playing an important part in the bringing together of a political project in that way was an important part of how Marx saw things in that time. Of course, what we also know is that the few amendments, as it were, or changes in terms of their attitude towards the Communist Manifesto, though they didn't change it because they saw it as an important historical document, was in the light of the Paris Commune. And we'll come on a little bit on that. So there we are, the Paris Commune, 18th of March to the 28th of May, 1871. Coming towards the end of the disastrous Franco-Prussian War, in which the French effectively attacked Germany and were absolutely routed at the Battle of Sedan. If anyone fancies a literary account of it, then Victor Hugo's Le Débâcle is an important document to read. So it's often overlooked that most of the communards during the Paris Commune were in fact Proudhonists. And it's Marx's encounter with Proudhon in particular, and the French anarchists, as well as, of course, subsequently Bakunin, who which has shaped a great deal of the dialogue, of the discussion that Marx has in his political life. It's this opposition that the anarchists all seem to have in common to any kind of participation in the political sphere that Marx took a virulent dislike for. So, although it wasn't written in Paris, the poverty of philosophy was, of course, a direct critique of the work of Proudhon, published initially in 1847, and then not really republished until after Marx's death. But nevertheless, the poverty of philosophy takes Proudhon to task, not just simply for being a very bad Hegelian, but also for being, in a sense, politically inept. Proudhon's idea were rooted in arguably his position as a kind of artisan in the context of France. And France is interesting in this respect. The overwhelming majority of French people at the time were working on the land. It was a predominantly agricultural society. And insofar as there was an industrial urban proletariat, those were largely confined to the cities and typically in small workshops. There weren't the sort of large industrial workshops that were beginning to develop in Germany, in France at the time. So lots of the proletarians in France would have been working in small workshops, which would have employed one, two, three, four people. I've always loved the photographs from the Commune. There is a bittersweet tinge to them in that they're magnificent photographs. But many of these people would have been killed subsequently. And those who were identifiable on the barricades were more likely to be killed. The photographs were actually used to identify people and pick them out, and they would be shot immediately rather than just simply sent to Devil's Island. 15,000 were killed in the immediate aftermath of the Commune, and a further 15,000 were shipped off to Devil's Island to die slowly. A few returned, were subsequently pardoned. So most of the communards were Proudhonists. Some were members of the International Working Men's Association, but many were also followers of Auguste Blanqui, a revolutionary who had spent much of his life in prison, much of his adult life in prison, an educated and intelligent man who devoted himself to a form of revolutionary activity which was concerned with individual acts of what the state would call terrorism, individual acts of insurrection, and often at great cost to himself. One of the demands of the communards was that Blanqui should be released. He never was, and so languished in prison when at the height of the revolutionary possibility. Marx famously argued that the communards really shouldn't do it. They shouldn't try to seize power in this way, because he knew that they would be overwhelmed, and if they were overwhelmed, it would put the workers' movement back for decades, and that's in fact what proved to be the case. Having said that, once they'd taken power, he said, "Don't stand there behind barricades. March on Versailles. You have to spread this revolution out." And of course, that's not a view they took. And it's these debates between anarchists and Marxist followers within the International Working Men's Association, which coloured, I believe, the development of Marx's attitude towards a party. The International Working Men's Association really was a broad organisation, including anarchists and British trade unionists with all their conservatism, and the left, which was kind of led by Marx and Engels. And the Commune shaped French politics for a generation, not least of which because what I've called at the bottom revanchism. Revanche is, of course, the French for revenge. And it coloured much of the debate which followed subsequently in French politics, the extent to which, for example, Marx, as a German, and Marx as a Jewish German at that, would be often used against him in the context of French politics. So the first international split, Mikhail Bakunin and James Goyim, Goyim, I don't know how you pronounce that one, formed the Jura Federation. There was effectively a kind of association within the association. It was on the basis of that that Bakunin and Goyim were expelled. I won't dwell upon the case of Sergei Nechayev, who killed somebody in Russia, and this was one of the many things, along with his kind of general conspiratorial approach towards politics on the part of Bakunin, that was kind of laid at his feet in terms of the need to expel him. So what then followed was a split in which the Anarchist International was formalized at its 1873 Geneva conference, the St. Imier conference, and then again formalized at the 1873 conference. And what characterized the Bakuninists, what characterized Pyotr Kropotkin afterwards, was really something that we see even in Proudhon, the idea that you abstain from the sordid business of the political world. You're not standing in elections, for example. You are instead dedicated to the moment, the idea of insurrection and individual acts of political resistance. And what it, of course, tended to do was lead to an intensification of state repression, largely a complete failure on the part of whatever escapade the anarchists got up to, and typically excellent militants otherwise languishing in prison for years on end as a consequence. And it's that abstention from the political process that seemed to annoy Marx in particular. So the development of the French party took various forms, and of course what we see is this, and I've mentioned it before in other kind of Why Marx series about this distinction between, if you like, the revolutionaries and the possibilists. The possibilists aiming for what can be achievable in the current context. As I've tried to point out, that even in the Communist Manifesto, you have a minimum maximum program. The maximum program is the overthrow of the bourgeois state, the overthrow of the bourgeoisie as a ruling class, and the establishment of a society in which property is held in common, but has a whole series of demands which could be done right here, right now. And that's just the point. The reformist sort of wing of the French workers' movement was really led by former anarchists, Paul Broussais and Benoît Malon, described in a letter by, as part of the. I can't recommend this enough. This is volume 46 of the collected works of Marx and Engels, and it's largely the correspondence of that period in a magnificent little letter written by Engels to Edward Bernstein from London when Engels was living near Primrose Hill on the 25th of October 1881. It describes Broussais and Malon as blockheads, among other things, and regards them as having really never lost their sort of anarchist folly. But at the same time, even if they've changed in terms of their attitude towards politics, they still retain some of the methods of anarchism. So what you ended up with eventually was two socialist parties, the Parti Socialiste Français, which was later led by Jean Jaurès, who, of course, was subsequently assassinated on the eve of the First World War, and the Parti Socialiste de France, led by Jules Guesde. I had to go and Google Jules Guesde to learn how to pronounce his name. I always thought it was Guide, but anyway, it's Guesde. So Blomqvist and Communard, Edouard Vallon. Again, the the authority of having been at the commune and having served on the barricades at the commune is a feature that crops up with regard to much of the political discussion in France at the time. This is Paul Broussais. Um, those are his dates. He was a doctor by trade. He joined the International Working Men's Association because, as I say, it was there were an anarchist wing. Broussais was a correspondent of Pyotr Kropotkin, and he advocated this propaganda of the deed. This is the individual act, this, assassinating this or that ambassador or king or whatever else. Um, and was the kind of leader of the possibilists, which is kind of irony, is an irony in that, isn't it? On the one hand, coming from the anarchist background to eventually ending up as a supporter of Jean Jaurès, who was, although sometimes underestimated, he doesn't get a good press among Marxists because Jean Jaurès was a sort of leader of the possibilists. He seems to have had a kind of a fairly honourable kind of position in terms of this wing of French socialists. Benoit Malon, by contrast, was from a peasant family. Which wasn't uncommon in those days. He gained an education by studying to be a priest. Interestingly, so calls Joseph Stalin, radicalized by studying Proudhon, and Proudhon was the kind of preeminent and best known socialist in France at the time, and retained his importance and his influence well after his death. But so after meeting Charles Longuet, who of course was Marx's son-in-law, he joined the International Working Men's Association in 1865, but sided with Bakunin against Marx. He fought in the Commune, but escaped to Switzerland and joined the Jura Federation. So on returning to France, on the formation of the Parti Ouvrier, it was initially just simply called the Parti Ouvrier, the Workers' Party. But later the Française bit was added in no small part because of that whole influence I mentioned about revanchism. So the idea that the Parti Ouvrier would have to have a French feel to it, to distance itself from the Germanizing influence, for example, of Marx. So Malon tended to side with Bakunin against Marx. So this is Paul Lafargue, who was Marx's other son-in-law, and Gued and Lafargue, between them, wrote about half of the program of the Parti Ouvrier Française, and Marx wrote the preamble, as we'll go on to see. We'll have a look at the full preamble, and I've paraphrased some of the demands of the minimum program of the Parti Ouvrier. So he married Laura Marx at St Pancras Registry Office, of all places. He was financially supported by Engels. He was, I think, highly influential upon Gued, and one of the people that kind of moved Gued, I think, to the left. And Lafargue and Gued were actively promoting Marxism in France. They translated, Paul and Laura translated Marx's work into French, and tragically, of course, died in the suicide pact in 1911, and Lenin spoke at their funeral. Here we come on to Jules Gued, born Jules Basile, and worked as a clerk. Marx has had quoted, of course, famously as saying, referring to the French Marxists, is, if I know one thing, if these people are Marxists, then I am not a Marxist. And poor old Gued has been sort of tarred with that. But actually, Engels writes very highly of him in that letter that I mentioned. He says, for example, he says of Broussais the most hopelessly muddle-headed man I have known. He he dropped the anarchy his opposition to voting, but retained the phrases and the tactics. But he says of Ged, in matters of theory, this man is by far the most lucid thinker among the Parisians, and was the one who takes and one who takes no exception at all to the and one who takes no exception at all to the German origins of present-day socialism. Ged's pamphlets and articles are the best to have appeared in the French language, and he is one of the best speakers in Paris. So there was a kind of ambivalence towards Ged. They recognised that he had his failings. He was the reason for the accusation of the reason for Marx saying he was not a Marxist. Marx was not a Marxist. Was that Ged was accused of revolutionary phrasemongering, and he was seen as he was seen as a rather kind of hot-headed kind of person who would do things impulsively. But he was recognized as having a particular strength for popularizing Marxist ideas to a French audience. He too had started off as an anarchist, was very much influenced by Proudhon. He wrote for Republican newspapers, and this is during the Second Empire, when, of course, the point about republicanism in the context of France was that there was always the possibility of a restoration of the monarchy, whether of the legitimists or the Orleanists, in the context of France. And so actually being a consistent Republican, as Ged was, that was the beginning of his radical road. In 1871, he was the editor of what was a radical Republican newspaper, Les Droits de l'Homme. He was a refugee in Geneva, and it's in Geneva that he became a Marxist, effectively. But he too, at the time, was opposed to taking part in electoral politics, which is why he was criticized by Marx for his revolutionary phrasemongering. He later subsequently went on to be elected as the Member of Parliament for Roubaix, which was an industrial area in the north of France. He later on had something of an inglorious history, not unlike we tend to, I believe, over-concentrate upon the betrayal of the German Social Democratic Party in terms of their voting for war credits in the First World War. But it also has to be remembered that the French socialists did the same, and most other affiliates of the Second International, with a couple of exceptions, I think the Bulgarians and one or two others, actually went along with it. They went along with the social chauvinism, and Ged subsequently didn't support, for example, Alfred Dreyfus in the Dreyfus affair. He didn't support the Russian Revolution particularly. He certainly supported the war and took a ministerial office in the French government during the war. So a thorough sellout altogether. The question is, of course, does that relate in any way to the program? I would argue not. I would argue that the program itself had defined the Parti Ouvrier Français as a thoroughgoing Marxist party, and we have to look elsewhere for an explanation. So the Parti Ouvrier, founded in 1880 by Jules Guesde and Paul Lafargue, and had split from the French party before. So as we'll go on to, we'll have a look at the program itself in a moment. It became the Parti Ouvrier Français in 1893. They added the kind of Français bit to differentiate it. So to try and draw a distinction, as it were, between itself and the idea that somehow there was a moment when Engels was talking about the attitude of people like Broussais, saying they're portraying it as they want to sell the French workers to Bismarck and the Prussians, meaning by implication that somehow Marx was an agent of Bismarck. So the Parti Ouvrier Français eventually merged with the Central Revolutionary Committee to form the Parti Socialiste de France, and this merged with the Parti Socialiste Française and it was at the instigation of the Second International that this merger took place. And so you have a real important fusion process in the context of the French Communist Party, the development of the French Socialist Party, under the influence of the Second International, to merge these two parties together to form the French section of the Workers' International. So let's actually turn then to the program of the Parti Ouvrier Français. This is the bit that was, so I've included it, the whole thing, as it stands. This was the bit that was written by Marx. Considering that the emancipation of the productive class is that of all human beings without distinction of sex or race. And this was an important move. If you look at who were members of the International Working Men's Association, they really were working men. There were women admitted, and they played an important role. But here you have right at the heart of the program, without distinction of sex or race. And this is important as well in the context of France with its empire at the time, and is certainly in advance of anything that was produced in Britain. Having said that, none of the parties of the Second International were particularly good in terms of their attitude towards the subject peoples of their respective empires. They paid some, to a certain extent, you could argue they paid a bit of lip service to it. The attitude, for example, of Gued wasn't to put the peoples of the French Empire at the center of his kind of campaigning. It was very much focused upon economic issues in the context of France, but also in the context of not just economic issues, but the demand for a socialist society. That the producers can only be free when they're in possession of the means of production. You can't put it much clearer than that. I mean, this is so succinct. Many parties today could learn a lesson from it. There are only two forms under which the means of production can belong to them: the individual form, which has never existed in the general state and which is increasingly eliminated by industrial progress; the collective form of the material and intellectual elements, which are constituted by the very development of capitalist society. Considering that this collective appropriation can arise only from the revolutionary action of the productive class or proletariat, organized in a distinct political party. Anyone who's been around on the left for any length of time would have had to have the tedious conversations about how you should be in the Labour Party, come what may, and the mistranslated part of the Communist Manifesto being quoted at you, where the communists do not form as parties separate from other working class parties, something which was written in the context of the Chartists in 1848 and bears no relation to the contemporary Labour Party, certainly not at the present. So in a distinct political party, that such an organization must be pursued by all the means the proletariat has at its disposal, including universal suffrage, which will thus be transformed from the instrument of deception that it has been up until now to the instrument of emancipation. Now, bear in mind, this is after the Paris Commune. Bear in mind, this is after Engels had famously written about not laying hold of the bourgeois state and using it for workers' ends, but the need to smash the state. But here we have a very clear phrase written by Marx that transformed from the instrument of deception that it has been until now to an instrument of emancipation. The French socialist workers, in adopting the aim of their efforts, the political and economic expropriation of the capitalist class and the return to the community of all means of production, have decided as a means of organization and struggle to enter the elections with the following immediate demands. Again, it's an echo of the Communist Manifesto, and I would suggest that this is a kind of culmination in what was started in the Communist Manifesto. I've paraphrased these because I don't want to overburden the slides with too much text, but you can see even today that some of these would be still radical demands: abolition of laws over the press, meetings and association, removal of the budget of religious orders. And of course, some of these are in the context of France at the time, still heavily dominated by the Roman Catholic Church, the suppression of the public debt. Anyone, even who understands bourgeois economics, knows that the idea of a national debt is something of an absurdity. The abolition of, and this is crucial, I believe, and again is a central lesson from the Commune: abolition of standing armies and the general arming of the people. The Commune, this is a kind of general concept, and it's an interesting one because it doesn't seem to presuppose the idea of councils in factories, but instead of the notion of a commune, a council, but of a perhaps of a geographical region or of a particularly large enterprise or whatever else, the commune to head administration and police. Um, uh, you can see how this one would be updated by now. One rest day a week, an 8-hour day, ban on children under 14 working, and they can work a maximum of 6 hours between the ages of 14 and 16. Protective supervision of apprentices by workers' organisations, legal minimum wage set by Workers' Commission. Now, here's an interesting one. That was explicitly put in by Ged, and Engels regarded it. I've got the quote somewhere. Ged, Ged regarded, Engels regarded, and Marx regarded the idea of just a legal minimum wage set by Workers' Commission as yeah, let him have that one. Because, of course, what Marx and Engels are arguing for was the abolition of the wages system. But nevertheless, Ged was allowed to have his way. And I think this is an important thing. The idea that Marx was dictating the nature of the party. Marx was very mindful of the importance of having workers playing a very active role in these parties themselves. Remember, the preamble to the first international was the liberation of the working classes, the act of the workers themselves. So legal prohibition of foreign workers being employed for less than French workers, not prohibition of foreign workers coming in, but that they could not be employed for pay less to foreign workers than to French workers. So internationalism remains firmly at the heart of these minimum demands. And that's, I think, a crucial lesson. Equal pay for equal work for workers of both sexes, scientific and professional instruction of all children, maintained by society and the commune, responsibility for the old and disabled, something certainly worth remembering. Prohibition of all interference in the in the administration of workers' societies, responsibility of the bosses in matters of accidents guaranteed by funds paid into workers' societies, an end to fines or withholding of pay by the bosses on the workers, annulment of the contracts that have alienated public property. So, you know, when we think about privatization and things like this, state-owned workshops to be entrusted to the workers who work there, the abolition of all indirect taxes and all direct taxes into a progressive tax on incomes over 3,000 francs, and all direct inheritance over 20,000 francs. These are still radical demands, and these are the minimum demands. So the idea of minimum and maximum demands somehow being, some sort of electoral cop-out and a participation in bourgeois parliaments for the sake of careerist opportunities is just a nonsense. Marx and Engels were determined that parliament would be used, but in a principled way. The fact that people like Geds and Karl Kautsky and Edward Bernstein, I mean, that letter that I quoted from Engels was to Edward Bernstein when Edward Bernstein was still a revolutionary. It's only later that he moved to a reformist, a revisionist position. So it's an interesting kind of discussion as to what was the driving force that led to the embourgeoisement, if you like, of so many parties of the Second International. But what we can't say is that that was somehow rooted in their program, and certainly not in the program of the Parti Ouvrier Français. Thank you very much.
Very good, comrade. Thank you very much. Really interesting how you set it in the context of the struggle in the commune, and then First International and how that split, etc. Really important to put it politically like that, and the transition from the Communist Manifesto to the program of the French Workers' Party. Comrades, if you have any questions or comments, please click raise hand, and we can discuss this a bit further. There's been a bit of a back and forth in the chat, so comrades who have something to say, please come in. The question of the state, then, what you were talking about there at the end, is an interesting one, isn't it? And Marx and Engels didn't have a full theory of the state. We've discussed this before. There was plans to have a capital, a volume on the state, but throughout their life, and Hal Draper looks at it, and others have looked at it, is they've moved about in their definitions of what a state is, and crucially, what our position should be towards the state. So you had Engels saying things like, in part, that you could take over the state, maybe just lob off some of the worst bits. That was a while ago. Then you have things like, during the Paris Commune, they've confirmed their idea that you can't actually lay hold of the ready state machinery, but you have to smash the state. And yet we also have things like the state has to wither away. There's different states we're talking about as well, isn't it? There's the Marx and Engels were talking about, yes, the bourgeois state has to be smashed. But can you, in your own words, sort of look at that question again? How does that, does that mean we can't have any demands on the state? Does that mean we shouldn't have any demands on the state? Should we just say, stand aside and basically say, if you get involved in elections, if you put demands on the state today, you're propping up the state. Instead, all we can say is smash the state. I mean, how did Marx and Engels view this issue?
It's certainly vitally important in the context of this constant fight with the anarchists. For the anarchists, the question was the state and the destruction of the state. They didn't seem to understand at all what Marx was saying, was that the state itself is thrown up by the nature of class relations. And so it's the end of the class relations that give rise to the state that has to be changed. But they recognized that it had to be a state, if for no other reason than to keep in check the counter-revolutionary forces that would inevitably follow. At one point, in reference to the commune, Engels writes, perhaps a little bit over-enthusiastically, but we can debate that. If you want to see the dictatorship of the proletariat, look at the commune. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat. Hal Draper, of course, has written about the dictatorship of the proletariat, and it's important that dictatorship in this context doesn't mean what we tend to think of dictatorship as now meaning. That is to say, dictatorial rule by one or two people. It was a reference, because they were thoroughgoing classicists, it was a reference to the dictatorships of ancient Rome in the Roman Republic. Under the Roman Republic, a dictator could be appointed to carry out a particular task for a particular reason for a particular length of time, and it was still accountable ultimately to the Senate. And it would be for a limited period of time. So Marx's attachment to the state is to understand the state as political violence, as force. The state as we have it today, with its professional army, its professional police force, its professional judiciary, and all the rest of it, is as the kind of the monopoly of violence in the context of a bourgeois society. But the state has come to mean a bit more. since Marx's day, hasn't it? I mean, because, for example, in discussing the state and the various things that it provides, the state has developed enormously since Marx's day. Uh, One of the things that was a feature of the German Social Democratic Party, but also other workers' parties and the cooperative movement in Britain and the trade unions in Britain, for example, was the development of self-help within the working class. So you have the development of a kind of state within a state of workers' organizations, which formed the kind of training ground of what would be a future socialist society where workers would actually be in control of the society. Um, but of course, in the period, in particular after the Second World War, many of the things that were actually a feature of workers' self-help were actually taken over by the state. Think of the National Health Service, education, and so on and so forth. Arguably as a concession, as a consequence um, of the Soviet Union. That's not to attribute anything positive to the Soviet Union. I don't attribute anything positive to the Soviet Union, but it was an important change, I think, and we see it too in terms of Keynesian management of the economy to take the rough edges off of capitalism and that sort of thing. I think in the context of what Marx and Engels were talking about as the state was the state as the bourgeois organization of violence to protect itself and to protect things like the property contract and all the rest of it. Um, so uh, So, although Marx and Engels held out some hope of the possibility of a peaceful transition to socialism, particularly in the context of North America, particularly in the context maybe of Britain, um, they were still thoroughgoing revolutionaries. I think any revolutionary worth their salt would want to see, if possible, a peaceful transition to socialism. An overwhelming majority of people decide they want a socialist society and vote for it, and they have principled politicians who stand and fight for that and get elected on that basis. We all know that no ruling group in history has ever given up power voluntarily. And we all know what happens to people who harbor the illusion or the delusion that you can somehow just simply legislate socialism into being. One of my earliest formative memories is of the killing of Salvador Allende. You know, there was Chile which was held up as a kind of almost the paradigm example of the illusion that was Eurocommunism. You know, the idea that you could have a, a thoroughgoing reformist group that was elected and could just somehow bring about socialism and just have a good example. Well, we saw what happened to him. And I don't think we can expect anything less. And especially in the context of the present, where we're seeing an increasing intensification of political repression in Britain today. So, yeah, I mean, Marx and Engels, as you know, didn't write blueprints or make. I mean, they're often kind of accused of making all sorts of predictions that didn't turn out, but actually they didn't make a lot of predictions, and they certainly didn't engage in um, in kind of blueprints or kind of utopian kind of dreams of what the future society would be like, except insofar as you can see a notion of around a society of freely associating workers. And I think that's the crucial part of it. And of course, there would be a period in which um, the state would exist and would have to be fully accountable to the workers themselves. You know, you see it in class struggles in France. You know, elected deputies should earn no more than the people they represent and should be recallable at any time. And I think any half decent communist would want to see that.
Hmm. Thank you, comrade. So smashing the state does not mean you can't. We shouldn't put forward demands on the state, and we shouldn't organize the working class to push for political demands. And that is part of actually smashing it, isn't it? Us taking it over as well and building up our own forces to take it over and building our proletarian state, which that can then wither away after some time. But yeah, communism will not be just one moment. You have a revolution, and that's that all done with. There will be some kind of transition. Got a couple of questions from the floor. Andy first. Hi.
Thanks for a really interesting seminar, Ian. Throwing a question, you mentioned in your response there around issues around the state and the state providing services. When you look at the history of the German Social Democratic Party, that it provided those services, medical services, educational services, which were then absorbed by the state, or the state came to provide them. That was a pattern across certainly the whole of Western Europe. In terms of the strategy around re-equipping the working class in order to kind of provide a pole of authority within society prior to a revolutionary upsurge, do we see a situation where, for example, in the UK, we would look to re-establish those independent of, for example, the NHS as a provider of health services, or would we look to democratise and have a programme for the democratisation of NHS services? As somebody who works in the NHS now, what I do see is a situation where you've now got these really large hospitals serving a very wide area, and it kind of detaches them from the local population. And also, often they result in poorer healthcare because you have people who have to travel great distances to access particular tests or access services, when actually those services should be dealt with or delivered much more closely at home. So the question, I suppose, is, as a programme of minimum demands, would we be looking to re-establish from scratch the kind of medical services, educational services, and also sporting infrastructure, cultural infrastructure under workers' control, or would we be seeking to democratise those things that already exist with a programme for delivering them much closer to people's where they live? I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Andy. Do you want to reply, Ian, to that?
Can do. I mean, I've worked for years in the NHS as well, and also in the private care homes, the old people's homes and stuff as well. And I saw that kind of transition from the closure of the old asylums to the development of social care as a private enterprise area, a way in which, in a sense, there was a kind of revalorization of social care, something which had previously been entirely in the NHS, and now you're in a situation where people have to sell their house to pay for the care of their elderly relatives and this kind of stuff. I think there's, in a sense, the two possibilities, the demands, if you like, are not mutually exclusive. I think we could call for the democratization of the NHS, as well as, for example, the nationalization of the drug companies. We have an absurd situation where drug companies, if they develop any kind of new medication, have a guaranteed monopoly for 25 years. So really they can charge what the hell they like. And it ends up being there's no relationship between prices and values. It's what Ernest Mandel calls a technology rent, where they can effectively demand whatever they like. And you certainly saw it in the early days, for example, whether it's the early days of HIV medication, and you see the same with any new medication, astronomical profits being made by the drug companies. So there are demands that we could make in terms of the NHS as it stands. But the interesting thing about it, from my point of view as well, is that how the contradictions within capitalism are leading to its collapse. I would defend free healthcare with my life, not least of which because my daughter was completely dependent upon it. But at the same time, I think the idea of a democratization of the NHS has to take into account what the history of the NHS was. I mean, it was really the nationalization and rationalization of poor law institutions which were established as a consequence of the institutional relief of poverty. So the asylums grew out of that to separate out the people who could not work from those who just simply didn't have a job, and also the poor law infirmaries, just to sort of provide a backstop medical provision for the very poor, but also that because there was a growing development of friendly societies that were providing for the working class, it would be a difficult thing to argue that we should go back to that. But I think the idea that the NHS is not going to be privatised is just fanciful. What I find also interesting is, I mean, for example, there's 140,000 vacancies in the care home sector. The situation as it stands isn't sustainable without a vast amount of investment, and it would be a key demand, I think, for any socialist society to say a key minimum demand of a huge increase in expenditure for health and social care. But at the same time, social care would have to be re-socialized. What you have at the moment is either large companies or small companies making profits out of social care. I mean, I worked in one of the cheapest end of the private care homes, and when I was working there, that was some years ago, it was £800 a week to keep an elderly person there, and that's in residential care, not even necessarily nursing care. And it would be considerably more now, and that was at the cheap end. So I think there is a question of having to rebuild our forces of self-reliance, but I don't think it's really easily feasible to think of kind of taking it over piecemeal. I think it would be a question of having to thoroughly democratize what exists at the moment and greatly increase the proportion of the economy which goes to meeting human need. That is what a socialist society would be, the meeting of human need first and foremost.
Thank you, comrade. Malcolm, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I worked all my life as an engineer, and what engineers have to do is simplify things to make them practical. Now, what everybody's always talking, get this off, sorry. I can't get rid of them.
We can hear you.
I know, I've got this
We can hear you.
Okay. So people keep talking about when this socialist society comes about and how will it be and the details and so on. But what really interests me is how do you get a transition from what we've got on a global scale now to anything remotely like a socialist society? Now, what I wanted to ask Ian, who's much more knowledgeable than me, and I like to say how much I liked his talk, was he sees state violence in the police and the army. Okay, well, would you say the civil service was state violence? Because through the civil service, we've now got a violent Home Secretary who's tried to make Palestine, or has made Palestine Action a terrorist group, has more or less destroyed Just Stop Oil by sending people to prison under terrorism laws. And also I'd be interested to see how health and education could be state violence, because education obviously doesn't educate people to be politically aware, in my opinion, and that obviously must be a choice somewhere. So is that a form of state violence, would you say? And in health, I don't know very much about health apart from my own experiences, and I've never worked in the health sector, but I don't know how health could be seen as state violence, but maybe it could. But what I think at the moment is we've got an extremely violent society, extremely violent on a global scale. And I don't see how you could overturn a violent society by peaceful means. And if you use violent means to overthrow something, you end up as being violent yourself. So that sort of destroys the whole point of the thing. So I'd just like to ask Ian how he sees the idea of current state violence spreading more than just to the police and the army. Thank you.
Interesting one. I mean, I've been in the NHS for years. I'm now currently working as a teacher in a sixth form college. One of the things I find interesting is I teach on what's called a T level. The T levels were developed to provide vocational education. particularly in things like health, because you can't get people to work in health for love nor money. And the idea is of training people to take up jobs in, for example, nursing, social care, that kind of stuff. I also teach on BTEC courses in health and social care, and similarly, these are courses of education of a sort which are quite clearly orientated towards making working class kids get working class jobs. You have a real fracture in education, in a sense, as stark as anything in Marx's day, where what training there is largely for working class people to get working class jobs, and the bourgeoisie get a genuine education, an education that can help people think. What's interesting about Marx's minimum program is that it includes, in both cases, health and education as a central demand of a socialist society. I would like to think a socialist society could come out in a peaceful way. I'm not optimistic, especially when we look at what's going on in the Middle East or wherever else, that the bourgeoisie will give up without a fight. And I think one of the things we're up against constantly is that people not necessarily against socialism if they understand what communism. I tend to use the terms interchangeably. I appreciate some people don't. But let's say okay, let's say socialism or communism. The people aren't opposed to it once they know what it is.
Exactly.
What we're up against is they think it's either what the Soviet Union was or what China is, and no one particularly wants that, or it's the 1945 Labour government, and people don't necessarily want that either, although that at the moment seems quite good compared to what we've got with the current government. I think the whole point with Marx, I think, is that it's not just a moral question. The capitalism is in decline, and it is creating the conditions for socialism. It might not look like it from where we stand. Most people on the left seem to think that it's almost impossible to bring about a socialist society, and so what we end up with is socialist groups tail-ending nationalist movements, or tail-ending this or that other group, or aping what the right wing say, whether it's in terms of migrants or whatever else, instead of actually sticking to a notion of a maximum program and a minimum program. If we can't give people the aspiration to see the end of commodity production in favor of all production to meet human need, then we really are up against it. That's and yet at the same time, what we're seeing is capitalism failing everywhere. And so the United States, for example, in the period after the Second World War, engaged in the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe as a means of providing a bastion against the possibility of socialism. But now all it can do is destroy. So any country that stands up against the United States, Libya, Iraq, or whatever else, is turned into a failed state. And that's the project, I think, that the United States has in mind for Iran. At the same time, you've got more and more people migrating to the rich parts of the world. You've got, at the same time, the money which is being funneled directly into violence. We look at moving towards 5% for defense expenditure at a time when we can't apparently get money to feed children. I mean, and I think one of the features of neoliberalism, call it what you will, is that it is making the class contradictions even more stark. At what point you can get to a situation where you can have a split in the armed forces, it remains to be seen. From my own limited experience, it's a mistake to think of the armed forces as being just a sort of everybody who's in the armed forces is a sort of right-wing nutcase or whatever. And what you have actually got is a net outflow of people from the armed forces, particularly in the context of Britain. In the context of the United States, where people often join the National Guard or they'll join the armed forces because it's the only way you can get Veterans Administration healthcare. So you have a kind of economic conscription. But we'll see whether that is the sort of direction which Wes Streeting has in mind for the NHS. But what certainly seems to be the case is that although NHS expenditure has been increased a bit, it's nothing like enough to even keep pace with the rate of inflation for healthcare. The rate of inflation for healthcare is considerably higher than the general rate of inflation. And it's an interesting feature of the decline of capitalism, where the needs-based sectors of the economy grow, and the ruling class spends its time trying to contain that. So human need is asserting itself over commodity production. And so whether we call the NHS part of the state or not, I'm kind of flexible around. I don't know whether we should even call it part of the state. It isn't part of the kind of violence, even if parts of the NHS, such as, I know, psychiatric care, I mean, I was a mental health nurse as well, you can be seen as having a sort of a state function. The fact that they're employed by the government is actually a feature of the socialization of services, which is a feature, I think, of the socialization of the wider society. And it's part of, in a sense, the contradictions of a declining capitalism. I don't know if I've answered.
May I come back just for a second? Because it seems to me, I mean, people keep talking about capitalism declining, but how I think Gaza is the sort of a paradigm for what the world is going to become. Because what you're going to have is powerful, extremely right-wing groups like the Zionists in Palestine or like the current administration. I mean, can you imagine when they bomb the nuclear facilities, these B-2 stealth bombers, they flew 7,000 miles in each direction to deliver 30 tons of bombs. Now, those people aren't going to say, oh, yes, well, why don't you have a go in my bomber? It's not going to happen. I mean, what it seems to me is going to happen is, and I'm not going to live to see it, but my grandchildren will, is that Gaza is the sort of, Gaza will get much bigger in areas. I mean, Libya, maybe, I don't know, parts of Africa, and they'll be penned in some way or another. They'll be starved, they won't have any facilities. And the people who've got the stuff will just keep more of the stuff. I mean, I don't really see how you can transition. I mean, the thing about education is, as you said, and many people have said, if people really understood socialism properly, they would realize it's for their own benefit, the benefit of their family and the benefit of everybody. But education stops people thinking like that. And if you say the word communist, everybody jumps about all over the place. I mean, they simply don't understand. They don't know anything about it. I mean, I've asked people who voted Brexit, say, what percentage of the population of England do you think are immigrants? And they say things like 15%, 20%. I mean, they're crazy. They don't know anything. So I think this lack of education is a real key, because when you talk about the working class is everybody who lives on what they earn, which includes people who are dentists, doctors, I don't know, all sorts of people who think of themselves as middle class. Until all that sort of layer of disinformation is removed, people are not going to, there isn't going to be a mass movement towards a socialist revolution. So you're just going to end up with these very, very physically powerful neoliberals, like the American army, etc., and the rest of the people are going to be treated like the people in Gaza, who are being shot when they're queuing up to receive food aid. I mean, can you imagine anything more depraved than that? I mean, but that's the British position, that's the French position, that's the EU's position. I mean, it's absolutely obnoxious, obscene. It's almost impossible to believe. I'll stop. I think I might be getting carried away.
Thank you, Conrad.
I don't disagree with you. I just wanted to make just a point about, for example, doctors and dentists and the rest of it. Dentists, of course, become completely privatized and now finding an NHS dentist is almost impossible. Doctors, interestingly, are being proletarianized, whether it's in terms of just simply forcing down the pay of doctors in general, and partly that's done with the introduction of physician associates. There are even anaesthetists and surgeon associates, which is an interesting thought. The idea of somebody who's given a 2-year training in a bit of basic anaesthetics. Well, I don't fancy that one myself. So we're also seeing the proletarianization of things which were once regarded as middle-class jobs. Teaching, I mean, my top of my salary scale is what, 39,000, which is just sort of band 6 of an NHS, bottom of band 6 of an NHS nurse. So the idea that teaching is somehow a kind of a middle class job is changed as well. So it's changing, and it's changing all the time. But the interesting thing as well, of course, is that relatively privileged groups of workers aren't necessarily the most docile. Historically, people like compositors or whatever were among the most radical and among the best paid. Miners were among, at one point, the most radical and among the best paid. I agree with you about the term communism up to a point. My point is I have determined to try and reclaim it. I think we've got no choice. If I call myself a socialist, I've got to explain myself. If I call myself a communist, I've got to explain myself. I might as well call myself a communist, because after all, it was the manifesto of the Communist Party that Marx and Engels wrote. And the interesting thing, of course, was when Socialist Appeal rebranded itself as the Revolutionary Communist Party, they massively expanded their numbers. Admittedly, they did so by recruiting largely students, and unfortunately replicating many of the sort of more irritating features of many of the kind of left groups being very undemocratic. I mean, I don't suppose anybody was particularly consulted on the name change or anything else for that matter. And it seems like a largely a rebranding exercise. But it isn't a term which is necessarily repellent to people. There was a time when nobody who stood up, with very few people could stand up in the United States and call themselves a socialist and have any hope whatsoever of getting elected. That doesn't appear to be the case in New York at the moment. So, I mean, the times they are changing. It might seem like we're on the bones of our arse, but actually one of the interesting things is the proletariat has never been bigger worldwide. And class relations, which had kept things fairly stable in Britain for generations in terms of a comfortable, stable middle class, are quietly falling apart, and will continue to do so, particularly under the impact of AI.
Matthew, please.
Hi, comrades. Thanks to Ian for that introduction. I think there's a few things. I mean, just as a sort of couple of points. I think the first thing, obviously, is the murderous nature of the ruling class. The latest estimate is that at least 377,000 people have been killed in Gaza as a result of the genocide. We're something that's been committed by the entire imperialist ruling class and its politicians. They're all soaked in blood in the eyes of the population of the world, the sort of people you're dealing with. I think the other point I would say, in terms of militaries, is it is becoming increasingly unpopular. I mean, if you look at the British military is having extreme difficulties in recruiting people for lots of reasons. And part of the fact, of course, obviously that the British have always historically treated their people who've been in their military with the utmost disdain, usually reducing them to the streets or the prisons afterwards. Even in the US, I mean, if you look at the two reasons, as you say, to join the military in the US are the GI Bill, which gives you free education, and the Veterans Administration, which gives you free healthcare, both of which have been gutted by Trump. So, and even before that, you could see they were having a real problem in trying to get people to join the military. And under conditions in which they're obviously saying, well, we're going to go to war, even more so than usual. It becomes lesser. I think the thing is, I think there's a couple of things really also to clarify. One is the nature of class rule. I mean, the thing is, we have to say, I mean, okay, you know, it's a wording, isn't it? You know, in terms of dictator proletariat, but it's about which class is actually in charge. I mean, if we look at it, we actually live under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class. The capitalist class decides what it is prepared to allow, and it tries to impose that. You know, there may obviously be resistance and the rest, but you know, clearly, you know, it does have considerable levers of control over all aspects of the society and what it will permit. You know, in terms of whether that's culture or economics. And as we can see, I mean, at the moment, I mean, the capitalist class is quite clear. It does not wish reforms in favour of the working class to take place. You know, that actually, of course, any reforms that take place should be in favour. It should extract more from the workers. You know, hence, obviously, what we see. You know, this vast accumulation of wealth in the hands of a tiny fraction of people, and actually, sort of things like, you know, the creation. I mean, the whole business of you know, quantitative easing, which is essentially the creation of large amounts of money, and it be handed over to the extremely rich. You know, it's incredible, really, and of course the corollary, of course, is that they then expect the working class to pay for that. You know, which wasn't explained to people at the time, but will be shortly. So it's in terms of the, as I say, the nature of class rule, and obviously, you know, dictatorship of the working class is quite different. It's in terms, you know, obviously the majority of people, and it's a process. It's part of the process of the working class abolishing class society itself, you know, and including obviously itself. You know, the society will be on a completely different basis, but then, you know, setting the parameters around which society is organised. I think that's important. The other question, which I think is, well, there's another question which I think is really important, is in terms of, you know, the nature of government and how socialists approach government and the state. And obviously, you know, you have this contradiction in terms of bourgeois democracy, in which bourgeois democracy is wrung out of the ruling class. It does not concede it. The capitalist class is not democratic by its instinct at all. However, it then seeks, obviously, to incorporate and transcend that concession, and to make sure that it has, you know, it controls all of the bodies and so on that exist, you know, which are technically democratic, and which obviously socialists can use, but have to be aware at all times that actually, of course, all these things are there for the use of the ruling class and not them. You know, you know, as Marx quite clearly states about the commune, you know, you can't just lay hold of the instruments of the existing state, you know, but it's how you do that, isn't it? I mean, there's a whole question, obviously, in France, you know, the whole Millerand question, which, I mean, quite correctly, Millerand was expelled for joining a capitalist government. But I mean, you've then got a situation where, you know, you know, as a socialist, how do you approach things like the local councils? You know, you can get people elected to these things, but you have to understand that this is a piece of the capitalist state. You know, it operates like that, and it's quite, you know, what you're doing actually, you know, is you're organising and then exposing the nature of that state, you know, and then precisely actually what happens, of course, is that the democratic wishes of the people and their representatives become increasingly divorced from what they're allowed to do, you know. And we can see that, you know, and you can see that, you know, whether that's local councils or in terms of parliament and so on and so forth. And actually, of course, the question becomes, well, where are the organs of working class power? And that these will be quite different. I mean, they operate differently. You know, you know, obviously things like workers' councils and so on and so forth are quite different basis in organisational and class terms. But it's then actually to you know, how do you actually approach these all, you know, technically democratic organizations of the capitalist state. And I think the final point I would make, obviously, is that, I mean, you know, actually, of course, Trotsky devises the transitional program as a means of dealing with the current transitional period, you know, which actually supersedes the whole question of minimum and maximum. You know, if you look at it and the way he does it, the way he goes through it, it actually goes through is at a higher level, you know, and really you should discuss that. Thanks.
Over to you, Ian. Yeah.
Thank you. There were a couple of things came up in the chat I just wanted to mention as well. There was talk about how do you split the army, and what you've got now is a situation where we're up against drones and things like that. Where I spent 12 years in the Army Reserve and did some operational service. I should say as a mental health nurse, and one of the patients I had was a young woman in the Royal Artillery who learned her skills as a was flying drones. She learned her skills playing Call of Duty in her bedroom, and she effectively, her job was to use these drones to pinpoint where to lay down barrages. And she came to see me because she had a mental health problem. So, I mean, the people who are in the army, whether they're flying drones or whether they're flying Apache helicopters, you could be a corporal in the Army Air Corps flying an Apache helicopter. Those corporals in the Army Air Corps don't come from upper class backgrounds. It's very interesting being in the army because the class divisions that exist in the wider society are replicated and magnified in the context of a military situation. The accents are very different in the household division than they are in the Royal Logistics Corps, I can assure you. What we as communists would be in favour of is movement away from a professional army in favour of a popular militia. And it's not so fanciful. I mean, effectively, Switzerland has a citizen army. It was a citizen army that won the Second World War. It was a citizen army that fought the First World War, for that matter. But I think it's one of those things that actually the bourgeoisie is morbidly afraid of. The idea of millions of people in arms is something that it's terrified of because it knows what the consequences of that potentially are. Things like local councils are interesting. I've had the dubious privilege of being a parish councillor, and it's almost a complete waste of time because what you're allowed to make decisions about is things like whether to buy some more swings for the local park. Laudable though they are, that's the kind of level of participation you're allowed to have. And I wasn't on it, by the way, because I was elected as a communist. I was co-opted because no bugger else wanted to do it, and I was interested in learning a bit about the machinery of local government. But it's an extremely long, arduous journey doing that sort of stuff. However, I'm not decrying it because actually at some point we're going to have to mount a challenge. What we're seeing at the moment, though, is a complete fragmentation of the left, and what passes for a mass party in the future that's supposedly to the left of the Labour Party is likely to be the kind of Corbynite lash-up that will probably lead to almost nowhere and will lead to yet another kind of blind alley until such time as we can forge a mass communist party. I firmly believe there has to be a party, and it has to be a communist one. It can't be. I mean, this is one of the things about the Parti Ouvrier Français, is that it wasn't a broad front. It wasn't some broad coalition. It was a party with a communist program, and that has to be the objective. Otherwise, what we're facing is just simply Labour Party 2.0, 3.0. And like it hasn't failed miserably up until now. If Marx is right about the decline of capitalism, I think the decline of capitalism is inevitable. What's not inevitable is what will happen in its place. Will it be barbarism, or will it be the possibility of seizing, or will it be, as the other possibility is put in the Communist Manifesto, the common ruin of the contending classes, that effectively climate change or some mutual nuclear destruction will see the end of humanity itself. The transitional program, as I understand it, with regard to Trotsky, and I'm sure there are better educated Trotskyists in the audience than me, is that it was at a particular time. And it was founded at a particular time for particular reasons, not least of which because Trotsky was expecting revolution in the aftermath of the Second World War. It didn't happen. And the problem we've got with a transitional program rather than a minimum maximum program is it doesn't pose the imminent possibility of communism. When I say imminent, I mean, it's not going to happen overnight. And there will be a transitional period. And I don't think there's anywhere in Marx and Engels' work where he's going to say, well, you're going to just wake up on day one of a socialist society and it'll all be firmly in place. There is going to have to be, and there will be transitional periods in terms of the movement of from a great long history in which we've been solely the subjects of a ruling class to now being the ruling class and having to learn how to rule as a proletariat. The problem I have as well with the idea of a transitional program of posing demands without that idea of a maximum and a minimum program is the tendency of it to devolve down to the reformist. And I think what you see in the program of the Parti Ouvrier is that the minimum maximum program are indissolubly joined. You can't take away the minimum program and somehow put that in and just say, well, that'll cause so many problems for the ruling class that they will just collapse, without having that other maximum program firmly at the heart of it as well.
Thank you, Comrade. I was going to ask you about that. There's one thing is the transitional program. You can sort of understand at the time how it was written by Trotsky. As you say, he did expect revolution to break out, and he thought, just by actually the transitional program is not as bad. It does actually reference communism and the communist future, but transitional programs, demands that we're seeing today by our Trotskyist comrades, they often don't touch on that at all. See, for example, the Socialist Workers' Party, what they put forward in any front they go into, and it tends to be very minimal demands. And the idea behind it is that they will the working class will automatically, by itself, they work out that, communism is the future by these demands. They will open that up, which is very dubious to put it mildly. And we had a question on that issue of the minimum maximum program in the chat, and perhaps I can ask you that before I bring in Ant, which is the role of the middle classes as well, and the need for the minimum maximum program and especially the minimum program to approach to look at the middle classes as well, to win them over. Because the way we actually get to socialism, to get to a point where we can smash those parts of the state that are the violence of the state, is by being the majority, isn't it? We have to win over the absolute majority in society. And that includes classes, and it's a growing class, actually. It's a proletarianized middle classes, but there are increasing numbers of people who do own their own means of production, be it a van, be it a shop, be it anything like that. They're unlike the proletariat, which owns nothing, not its own means of production. An increasing number of people in Britain today do own some of their means of production. So we need to have a program to win them over if we are serious about making majority revolution and not a coup, not a putsch, which I think is what distinguishes communists from anarchists, for example, who think they can do it with, by willing it along. And we understand we can't. There are no shortcuts. We have to win people over. So how do you view that issue of winning the middle classes? And I think Frank put it in the program in the chat. Are they the most dangerous classes, that we have to keep and look at, and are they more dangerous perhaps than, the bourgeoisie? Are they our enemy? Are they our potential allies? How do you see that issue, and which role does the minimum program play in winning them over?
it's a bloody good question. I mean, the middle classes have changed hugely throughout the 20th century. When Marx was writing the Communist Manifesto, in preparation for this, I had another quick skim through the Communist Manifesto, and Marx, for example, was talking about the middle classes as being potentially a reactionary class. In the context of Germany with a large peasantry, in the context of France with a large peasantry, the possibility of a peasantry defending their position against the possibility of socialism was a very real one. And of course, it was something that the Bolsheviks attended to most carefully. The idea of the peasant, and therefore there had to be the centrality of the land question and so on. In the context of most developed in capitalist societies today, the middle class is completely different. Not only has there been a growth of a different type of middle class, state employees, doctors, teachers, social workers, nurses, and so on. But what they all have in common is that they're proletarians. They sell their labour power. They might be slightly more privileged proletarians, but nevertheless they're proletarians, and they're actually starting to see wages being forced down, and we're starting to see a greater concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands, and it's not lost on the middle classes either. I think it's very important that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Attempts at kind of forced collectivization were a disaster, and are likely to be a disaster in the future. If you're going to say to people, we're going to nationalize your chip shop, I mean, what's the chance? I mean, what would be the point? It seems to me that the chip shop works pretty well. Leave it alone. We've got bigger fish to fry. So, from that point of view, you absolutely have to win over the middle classes, and we don't. I don't see myself in an antagonistic relationship, for example, even to the police. On the last Palestine Solidarity demonstration in London, what was interesting is that most of the coppers were just sort of mingling with the demonstrators. I'm not saying they were being fraternal or sort of rubbing shoulders with them or whatever else. But if you chatted to the police, they weren't hostile. They weren't. And from you can even start talking to them about how their pensions are somewhat worse than they were 20, 30 years ago, and how their wages too are being forced down, and actually how, interestingly, as a corresponding feature, is that the police force is becoming somewhat feminized. It's sort of been forced down from where police pay was always kind of pegged at skilled manual labour. That was largely skilled male manual labour. It is actually declining relative to skilled manual labour. And I think there are whole swathes of the population even people like with vans or whatever. I mean, how precarious is that life? You own a van and you're a delivery driver and you're self-employed, but you're so precarious that you're actually worse off than if you were employed directly by the council as a van driver, or even if you might earn a bit less or whatever as a council. At least you know how much is coming in at the end of the month, and you can get a pension at the end of it all. So I don't think we need to concern ourselves with. I think we need to be winning over big swathes of the middle classes, and including, by the way, civil servants and the like. I mean, if we've got a complicated society to run at the end of it, the people who are already doing it need to be on our side, and arguing that somehow they are the enemy when actually it's the haute bourgeoisie, it's the owners and controllers of the means of production that are our enemy, not the owners and controllers of the. My favourite fish and chip shop name is in County Durham, and people who like the Who will understand the allusion. It's called Quadrophenia. Superb.
Very good. And please.
Did that work?
Yep.
Great. Okay. I'm going to try and keep it very brief, but again, I think I'm going to leave this with a headache again. To me, we seem to be, you seem to be constantly trying to sort of like, circle the square, or you try to try to bring two, resolve a contradiction that can't be resolved. And I think, I was quite surprised when Matthew started talking about, workers' councils and organs of working class power, because every time I brought up this question, I've been basically told that is all old hat. It's all it's something that's gone. It's from the past. It no longer applies. I remember that sort of like I actually quote, I took the time to go through McNair's book Revolutionary Strategy and picked out all the quotes where he basically said that all the ideas about Soviets and workers' councils and all the rest of it is basically, well, is garbage. Yeah, he refutes them all. I remember the last time I spoke, and I think it was Jack Conrad said, workers' councils, but we've got councils already. As if the local council was anything like a revolutionary organ of power. The point being that working class cannot come to power like the bourgeoisie did. It can't build up its property, and take bits of capitalism over gradually. The start point for the working class is revolution, and it simply cannot delegate its authority to some sort of like representative body. Even if that representative body has hundreds of thousands of members, like some sort of hopefully a revolutionary party of the future. It's a question of the whole, well, vast swathes of the working class, and hopefully eventually the overwhelming majority of the working class has to become active. It has to become actively revolutionary. I think Marx said something like, I can't quote it exactly off the top of my head, but when we talk about the proletariat, it's not just the proletariat that we can see at this exact moment in time. It's what it must become. Yes, it must become something very different to what it is now. So today, the proletariat, the working class, it's passive mass of exploited people who spend all their energy doing the boss's bidding and come home and watch telly or whatever. No real interest in much outside of that. Obviously I'm generalizing, and that's not everybody, but what I'm a revolutionary situation. It could well be a catastrophic crisis scenario. The working class has in bulk got to get involved. Yes, so it can't simply elect some party members or whatever to do it for it. So there is very little analogy between the existing sort of like councils that we've got now and the revolutionary workers' councils. I think as Ian mentioned, Allende in Chile, and I think we all know the ruling class will not simply walk away. At some point in all this process, it's going to be thus far and no further. Then it's going to come down to violence. And how does the working class stand up if it's not self-organizing? It's going to be all the options are going to be close to it. It's going to be naked ruling class dictatorship. The only way the working class can stand up then is through its own organs, or its own self-created organs. So in my mind, any dismissal, any talking down of the necessity of self-created workers' organs, you basically, you're just playing into the hands of the ruling class. You're just trying to navigate the same waters as the capitalist left, where we can use the existing state and all the legal mechanisms and all the rest of it, and somehow socialism will arise, which is precisely not the case at all. We cannot come to power through the existing state structures. I just like to end with one thought. This there seems to be this this big argument about the small business owners and the chip shop and all the rest of it, which personally I don't pay much attention. I think You know, maybe this revolution is possibly years or decades away, if ever. You know, there's no guarantee of a revolution. But I think that the point is we don't have to legislate away these small businesses. They'll close down because they can't compete with the socialized sector. So that's I think that's the way that we get rid of the small business sector, is that we do it better, and there will be no incentive for people to want to operate in a primitive setting, which is very hard and difficult to work in. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Maybe so. Thank you. Ian, do you want to reply to and then also sum up?
Sure.
Okay.
On the workers' councils, we were having a conversation before the start, Tina and I was saying that my break with Stalinism was through council communism, and even now I would say, look, read Pannekoek, read Gorter, read Paul Mattick. They're all well worth a read. They were a left critique of Leninism, but read it as a Marxist, that is to say, critically. I think we're talking about Trotskyism and Trotskyist. Is the interesting thing is just how un-Trotskyist, how unlike Trotsky many of the Trotskyist groups are. Of course, it depends. Will the real Leon Trotsky stand up? There are different periods in his life when he was writing magnificent things that are an important and necessary corrective to understanding the horrors of Stalinism. And there are other things where he was wrong. And I think there are areas where Lenin needs to be looked at very, very critically indeed. But unless we look at it scientifically, then we're lost, because the one thing we've got going for us is our ideas. Council communism. I think one of the difficulties is when you try and reconcile it with reading Paul Brouet's magnificent history of the German Revolution, you find it intriguing just how much the workers' councils themselves were subject to different forces. I mean, even Max Weber, bless his cotton socks, no Marxist he, was once a member of a workers' council. People were in workers' councils, weren't just in workers' councils as individuals. It wasn't just a kind of collective spirit in the workers' councils. There was a collective spirit. There's a collective spirit when you go on the London Marathon, but it's different. There's a collective spirit in the workers' council, but look, people who were in the workers' councils were members of parties with programs not dissimilar to the party of the Parti Ouvrier, who had programs that were heavily influenced by Marx and Engels. The decline of capitalism, as I say, is inevitable. Why would capitalism alone throughout history be the only political economic system to be eternal? What has been the transition? If you look at the transition from feudalism to capitalism, it took place over hundreds of years. And yes, there were violent revolutions and long periods, and of course periods of reaction. There were periods in which, but what didn't change was that the conditions for the overthrow of feudalism continued to mature until such time. I mean, there were whether you look at the rebellions by the Lollards or Wat Tyler or whoever else, there were attempts to overthrow feudal relations long before Charles I had his head cut off, never mind Louis XVI. So that it seems to me inconceivable that a socialist revolution will happen on a day. It will just be the storming of Buckingham Palace and Bob's your uncle. Obviously, there has to be a revolutionary transformation. But the form taken by that, and the form taken by organs of proletarian control and government and statehood, as it were, are open to question. One of the greatest books I think that Leon Trotsky ever wrote was 1905, not least of which because he was bloody well there. He was, on the Petrograd Soviet, and this was a novel form. and viewed by some with suspicion. And it seems to be inconceivable that there won't be new novel forms. What I've always got from my experience with reading the Council Communists was that the working class very firmly has to be in charge. But there also has to be a party, in my opinion, and it has to be a mass party, and not just simply another lash up of reformists with no program whatsoever, or even of people who regard themselves as leftists or Trotskyists with no program whatsoever. Where do you stand? And I think our principles are among the most important feature of being a communist. And I think if we learn nothing else from the Parti Ouvrier, it is that the only way to be a mass communist party is with a principled program and principled people who are subject to the discipline of a party. Because if you're going to go and stand for office, you've got to stand for office in a principled way, and you're not doing it out of reformism, you're not doing it out of opportunism, you're not doing it to further your own career, you're not doing it just because it gets you on the bloody telly or some other thing. And that's crucial. And I wouldn't rule out for a moment standing for a council election, but it wouldn't be just so I can help to administer paving stones. It would be to be able to act as a tribune in a local environment because people demand it, but also because it's a way of building from there to standing elsewhere, in whether it's for Parliament or whatever, and again to stand purely as a workers' tribute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. I also think it's worth remembering that they did talk about the abolition of the standing army and the general arming of the people. No left organization will touch that today. It seems like absurd. Not that it's too radical. It's bizarre. It's viewed as that. And ditto, no foreigner should be employed for less than the national counter, the British, it's the French in that respect, but here, of course, the British, which is not something the trade union movement, unfortunately, is very keen on either today. So, this is 150, 60 years ago, and it was much more radical than what the left dares to say today. Although, as you say, the working class is much bigger. Capitalism is in much more crisis, and it is threatening all of us, our total survival. So, and we can't put radical demands like they did. It's a terrible state the left is in. We'll be revisiting these questions, no doubt, when it comes to the Corbyn party, but also next week when we're taking a look at the Bolsheviks and their program in 1917 and the question, did it fail? That's a thesis of some on the left. Looking forward to it. Thank you very much, Ian. Fascinating session. And thank you all for your contributions and comments. Very good session. Good night, comrades.